The day my brother handed me a cashier's check for $12,000 and told me to sign the quitclaim deed, I almost did it. I was sitting in the conference room of Aldridge and Webb, the family attorney's office, on the third floor of a brick building downtown Knoxville. The leather chair I was sitting in probably cost more than my truck. My brother Garrett was across the table from me, wearing a charcoal suit I'd never seen before, his hands folded like he was closing a deal, not burying our father. Our father had been dead for 11 days. "It's fair, Seth," he said. "You know the farm hasn't turned a profit in years." I looked at the check. Then I looked at the attorney, a man named Aldridge, who had apparently known our father for 30 years, but kept glancing at Garrett like he was the one paying the bill. Which, I realized then, he probably was. "Dad left it to both of us," I said. "He left the business to both of us. The land is a liability. 12,000 gets you clear of the property taxes, the back maintenance, the Garrett." I set the check on the table face down. "I'm not signing anything today." He didn't yell. That wasn't Garrett's way. He just looked at me the way he'd been looking at me since we were kids. Like I was a problem he hadn't finished solving yet. I drove home that afternoon to my apartment, a one-bedroom off I-40 that I shared with 3 years of accumulated regret and a couch I'd bought from a Facebook marketplace listing. I sat on that couch for a long time. I was 31 years old. I worked HVAC installation for a contractor out of Maryville. I made decent money when the work was steady, which it wasn't always. I had about $4,000 in my checking account and a truck with 140,000 miles on it. What I did not have was any reason to hold on to a broken-down farm in the mountains of East Tennessee that I hadn't visited since I was 19, except I kept thinking about the last conversation I'd had with my father. Not the last one at the hospital, where he was mostly medicated and slipping in and out. The one before that, 3 weeks before the stroke, when I'd driven up to see him on a Sunday in October. He'd made coffee and we'd sat on the back porch, and out of nowhere, in the middle of a conversation about nothing important, he'd said, "Seth, don't let anyone talk you out of the alderman place, whatever they say." I'd thought it was just him being sentimental. He always called the farm by its original name, the Alderman Place, after the family who'd owned it before my grandfather bought it in 1961. I hadn't thought much about it, until Garrett put a check in front of me. The Alderman Place was 43 acres in Granger County, about an hour northeast of Knoxville. My grandfather had built the main farmhouse in the early 60s, added the dairy barn in 71, and by the time my father inherited it, the dairy operation was already dying. Dad tried beef cattle for a while, then hay. Then he just kind of gave up and moved to Knoxville and rented the fields to a neighbor for grazing, and the farmhouse sat empty. When I pulled up the gravel drive for the first time in 12 years, I had to sit in my truck for a minute before I could get out. The porch had partially collapsed on the left side. The roof over the mudroom was visibly sagging. Every window on the north face was either cracked or boarded over. The old pin oak in the front yard had dropped a major limb at some point, and it was still there, half-rotted, lying across what used to be a flower bed. I got out of the truck, and the November air hit me hard, cold and damp and smelling like dead leaves and clay mud. I stood there looking at this wreck of a building and thought about Garrett in his charcoal suit and his $12,000 check, and I thought, I don't even know why I'm here. But I went inside. The front door wasn't locked. The lock had corroded, and the door just swung open when I pushed. The inside smelled like mildew and old wood and something else underneath. Something that was actually almost familiar. Linseed oil, maybe, or the particular smell of my grandfather's workshop. I hadn't thought about that smell in a long time, and it stopped me in the hallway. My grandfather's name was Teddy, Theodore Aldred Colvin. He'd died when I was 9, and what I remembered about him was that he had very large hands, and he never raised his voice, and he made things, furniture, mostly, and small carved animals that he lined up on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. He was the kind of man who fixed things instead of replacing them, the opposite of everything the world seemed to reward. I walked through the house slowly. The kitchen floor had a soft spot near the refrigerator that flexed under my weight in a way that made me nervous. The bathroom ceiling had water damage that had buckled the drywall into a kind of topographic map of past disasters. In the back bedroom, which had been my grandfather's, the window on the east wall had a crack running the full length of the glass, and the afternoon light came through it in two different angles. I should have turned around. I should have taken the $12,000 and signed the deed and moved on with my life. Instead, I drove back to Knoxville, put in my 2 weeks at the HVAC contractor, packed what I owned into the bed of my truck, and moved into a farmhouse with no working heat in the middle of November. My buddy Kevin, who I'd known since high school, told me I'd lost my mind. He wasn't entirely wrong. The first 2 weeks were about survival more than renovation. I got the wood stove in the living room operational. It just needed the flue cleaned and a new door gasket, which I sourced from a stove supply place in Morristown. I patched the worst of the roof leaks with roll roofing and roofing cement, which is not a permanent solution, but it kept the rain out. I tore out the collapsed section of porch before it took down more of the structure. That was 4 days of work by myself, with a reciprocating saw and a pry bar, and the kind of aching back that makes you question your choices every single morning. I had my tools, which were good. I'd accumulated a solid set over years of HVAC work. I had the $4,000 in my checking account and the knowledge that I needed to make it last. I ate a lot of eggs and rice and whatever was on sale at the IGA and Bean Station. I watched YouTube videos on structural repair on my phone, propped against the wood stove, and I drove to the library in Rutledge twice a week to use the internet and check out books on old house restoration. I wasn't miserable. That surprised me. I was exhausted and cold, and my hands were cracked and bleeding by the second week, but there was something about the work that felt honest, I guess. Like every hour I put in, something actually changed. The house got a little more solid, a little more like something a person could live in. At the HVAC job, I'd spent years making buildings comfortable for other people. This was the first thing I'd ever fixed that was mine, or half mine, allegedly. Garrett called twice. I didn't pick up either time. By December, I had heat, a functioning kitchen, and a dry roof over most of the house. I'd started on the structural repairs, sistering the compromised floor joists, replacing the subfloor in the kitchen, repointing the chimney with fresh mortar. An older man named Bud, who owned the neighboring property and had been grazing his cattle on our fields for going on 15 years, came by one afternoon with a pie his wife had made and spent about 2 hours walking around, telling me everything he knew about the history of the house. He'd known my grandfather. Teddy was particular, Bud told me, standing in the living room with his hat in his hands, looking around at the work I'd done. Particular about things being right. He'd have appreciated what you're doing here. I didn't say anything, but I thought about that for a long time after he left. It was the week before Christmas when I got to the back bedroom. I'd been saving it, partly because it was structurally the most intact room in the house, and partly because it had been my grandfather's space and something about it felt like it deserved to be last. By that point, I'd been sleeping in the front bedroom, which I'd gotten into livable condition early on. The back bedroom, my grandfather's room, still had his iron bed frame in it, the mattress long since ruined, and some of his tools hanging on the wall beside the closet, which I hadn't touched. I went in there to start measuring for new drywall. The water-damaged ceiling I'd already assessed. The walls seemed solid. I was checking the baseboard with my knuckle, tapping along looking for soft spots, when I noticed something. The north wall of the room, the one facing the barn, had a different sound to it. Not the whole wall, just a section of it, about 4 feet wide between the closet and the window. Everywhere else, I tapped along that wall, I got the solid thump of drywall over studs. But in that section, the sound was hollow, not the kind of hollow you get when you hit between studs. A deeper hollow, an empty space hollow. I stood there for probably 5 minutes. Then I went and got my stud finder. The stud finder found nothing in that 4-foot section. No studs, no wiring, no pipes, just absence. I measured the room from the hallway door to the outside wall, then went outside and measured the same dimension along the exterior. There was a 14-inch discrepancy. 14 inches. Roughly a foot and a half of interior space that didn't exist on the inside of the room but did exist on the outside of the house. I stood in the dead winter grass and looked at the north face of the farmhouse for a long time. From the outside, there was no indication of anything unusual. The original board and batten siding ran straight and even. Whatever was behind that drywall, it had been designed to look like nothing from every angle. My grandfather had built a hidden space into the wall of his bedroom. I went back inside. I sat on the floor of the hallway outside the room, and I ate a peanut butter sandwich, and I thought about what my father had said. Don't let anyone talk you out of the alderman place. Not, this place has sentimental value. Not, your grandfather loved this land. Specifically, don't let anyone talk you out of it. He knew something was here. I didn't open it that day. I'm not sure why, maybe some instinct to sit with it a little, or maybe I was just afraid of what I'd find, or not find. What if it was empty? What if it was just dead air and old insulation, and I'd built up this whole thing in my head for nothing? I opened it the next morning. I used my oscillating multi-tool to score the drywall along the edges of that hollow section and cut it out in pieces. The drywall came off in big panels. Behind it was a layer of old plank sheathing. The original interior wall from before the house was drywalled, sometime in the 50s probably. I used a pry bar to pull the sheathing boards off one by one. Behind the sheathing was a framed cavity, just like I'd expected, about 14 inches deep, 4 feet wide, and running floor to ceiling. Inside the cavity, sitting on a plank shelf my grandfather had built across the middle height, were 3 things. A metal strongbox with a combination lock, a manila envelope, thick with papers, sealed with packing tape that had dried to a yellow crisp, and a smaller envelope, letter-sized, with my name written on it in my grandfather's handwriting. I recognized his handwriting from birthday cards. He'd died when I was 9. He had written my name on that envelope when I was 9 years old or younger, which meant he had been planning this for more than 20 years. My hands were shaking when I picked up the letter. Seth, if you found this, it means you didn't walk away from the alderman place when someone told you to. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you should know I'm proud of you for that, even if I'm not around to say it. The box combination is your grandmother's birthday. Month, day, year, 2 digits each. You'll figure it out. The large envelope first. Read everything in it before you open the box. I love you, boy. Take care of the land. Grandpa Teddy-I sat down on the floor of that bedroom with the letter in my hands, and I stayed there for a while. The large envelope contained 41 pages of documents, and it took me most of that day and part of the next to understand what I was reading, the short version. In 1987, my grandfather had entered into a partnership agreement with a man named Clifford to develop a portion of the alderman acreage, specifically a 12-acre parcel along the creek at the north end of the property. The plan had been a small residential development, 6 lots, which in the late 80s would have been worth real money. Clifford was a developer my grandfather had met through the farm co-op. They'd signed a formal partnership agreement, filed it with the county, recorded it properly. What happened next, according to the documents, was that Clifford had manipulated the partnership records. He'd created a second version of the agreement with altered terms. Terms that gave him full ownership of the developed parcel in exchange for a development fee that he'd allegedly already paid, except he hadn't paid it. And the signature on the revised agreement, which had somehow ended up as the official recorded version in the county register, was not my grandfather's signature. My grandfather had spent 4 years trying to prove this through the courts. The original attorney he'd hired had not been competent and had let a statute of limitations deadline pass. A second attorney had told him he had a case but would need significant money to pursue it. Money my grandfather, by then in his mid-60s and in declining health, didn't have. So he'd kept the documents, all of them. The original signed partnership agreement, notarized. A handwritten comparison he'd made between his actual signature and the forged one on the revised agreement. correspondence with both attorneys, a letter from a document examiner, a woman he'd apparently paid out of pocket, stating that in her professional assessment, the signature on the revised agreement showed signs of being traced from another document. 12 acres along the creek. In 1987, maybe worth 40 or 50,000. In the current market, I had no idea. But I looked up a real estate listing for a property 2 parcels north of ours while I was sitting there, and the per acre price in that area was running somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000. 12 acres, at $10,000 an acre. The Clifford family. Clifford himself had died in 2009, but I knew from Bud's conversation that his son had taken over the development business, had been in possession of 12 acres that were not rightfully theirs for nearly 40 years. I sat in my grandfather's bedroom in the house my grandfather had built, surrounded by 41 pages of his careful, meticulous documentation, and I thought about Garrett in that attorney's office with his cashier's check and his folded hands. I thought about how Garrett had always been the one with the head for business, the one who handled the estate, the one who'd told me the farm was a liability, that it was worth nothing, that I should cut my losses and walk away. Garrett, who had handled all the paperwork after my father's death. Garrett, who had access to everything in my father's files. Garrett, who had known, must have known, that this envelope existed somewhere on this property. I called Kevin. Not because I needed someone to talk me down. I was past that. I called him because he'd spent 6 years working in commercial real estate before he went back to school, and he knew more about property law than I did. He drove up the next morning, took one look at the documents spread out on my grandfather's kitchen table, and didn't say anything for about 3 minutes. "Seth," he finally said. "I know. If this holds up, I know." He took out his phone and started making notes. "You need a real estate attorney, not a general practice guy, someone who specializes in adverse possession and title disputes, and you need a forensic document examiner, a current one, with credentials that will hold up in court. Can you find me names?" "Yeah," he set his phone down. "How are you on money?" "I have about $2,200. He nodded slowly. "I'll make some calls." What happened over the next 6 weeks is a longer story than I have room to tell here, but the shortened version is this. An attorney in Knoxville named Patricia, who specialized in property title disputes, agreed to take the case on contingency after reviewing the documents. She brought in a certified forensic document examiner from Nashville who, after a thorough analysis, produced a written assessment that was considerably stronger than the one from 1987. The technology had improved substantially. The examiner identified specific characteristics of the signature on the revised partnership agreement that were inconsistent with any other known example of my grandfather's handwriting. The case did not go to trial. When Clifford's son, who turned out to be in his late 50s, still running the development company his father had built, was informed of the findings, and when his own attorney presumably told him what the forensic report meant for their position, there were negotiations. I was not present for most of those negotiations. Patricia handled them. She was good at her job. What the strongbox had contained, I should say, was not money. It was the original deed to the Alderman property, the full 43 acres, signed by the original owners and transferred to my grandfather, along with several other historical property documents. My grandfather had apparently been worried at some point that someone might try to challenge the main property's title as well, and he'd wanted the original deed in a secure place. There was also a folded piece of paper with a note in my grandfather's handwriting that said only, "The truth doesn't expire. It just waits." The settlement was finalized in late March. I'm not going to state the exact number because the agreement included a confidentiality provision, and Patricia told me to mean it when I said I'd abide by it. What I will say is that 12 acres of creekfront property in that part of East Tennessee, held for nearly 40 years while a development company built value on it and around it, and the corresponding negotiation over decades of unjust enrichment. The number was enough to change the shape of my life. It was enough to pay Patricia. It was enough to finish the farmhouse properly, not patch and pray, but actually finish it. New roof, new windows, repaired foundation, refinished hardwood floors that turned out to be white oak under 60 years of grime and wear. A kitchen that actually worked. A bathroom that didn't have its own microclimate. I hired a local contractor for the structural work I couldn't do myself, and I worked alongside him every day. I moved into that farmhouse in June, into the room that had been my grandfather's, in a house that was solid and warm, and smelled like fresh-cut lumber and linseed oil. And Garrett had known about the envelope. Not what was in it specifically, but he'd known our father had mentioned something being hidden at the farm. He'd found a reference to it in some of our father's private notes after the death. That was why he'd wanted me off the property. Not because the farm was a liability, because he was afraid I'd find something that complicated his clean inheritance of the business. I didn't take him to court over that. There wasn't a clean legal case for it. Knowing something exists and not disclosing it is not the same as fraud, apparently, or at least that's what Patricia told me. But I did call him, once, after the settlement. I didn't yell. That's not my way. I just told him I'd found what our father wanted me to find, that the farm was doing fine, and that he should think about whether the family business was really built on the foundation he thought it was. He didn't say much. The last thing I said to him was, Grandpa Teddy kept every piece of paper, every letter, every agreement, every record. He kept all of it, and he kept it safe. That's what he passed down to me. Then I hung up. Bud and his wife came over for dinner in July, the first time I'd had anyone over to the house. His wife had brought a pie again, peach this time, from their trees, and we ate on the back porch while the sun went down over the barn and the fields and the 43 acres that my grandfather had spent his whole life tending. He would have loved this, Bud said, looking out at the fields. He would have just loved to see this. I thought about a man I'd barely known, who had spent years fighting a wrong he couldn't fix and had eventually decided that the best thing he could do was document everything and leave it for someone who might be able to. I thought about him sitting in this room writing my name on an envelope when I was a little kid, trusting that someday I'd find it and know what to do with it. The truth doesn't expire, it just waits. I looked out at the land and the last of the light on the water and I thought, yeah, I think I'm going to be okay here.